everybody. Welcome to the Blind Spot series. And this is a series where we take a movie that's popular that we haven't seen and we talk about it. And I am film critic Grace Wagner, and Monda's here.
Hey, good to be back.
Yay. And today is kind of a special occasion. It's not just me and Monda on the Blind Spot Project. We have somebody who this is definitely not their blind spot. We have Griffin Schiller here to talk with us because we're talking about Dr. No, the very first Bond movie. Bond is like a huge blind spot for me. And so this was perfect for this series. And Griffin, thank you so much for coming on and doing this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I always love talking Bond, but it's fun to talk about it with I guess the two of you who've never seen this before, so that'll be really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're a big Bond fan.
Yeah. That's like my franchise. Like some people like Star Wars, some people like Marvel and DC and stuff like that. My franchise is Bond and kind of has been ever since I was I don't know, like in middle school or something like that.
Yeah.
I was like a Star Wars kid growing up, but then I really latched on to Bond somewhere along the way, probably when like Casino Royale came out. So yeah.
Yeah,
nice.
and you've seen all of them.
Oh yeah,
multiple times. Yeah.
yeah.
And Monda, how many have you seen?
All of the Daniel Craig ones, and now Dr. No. So I haven't seen anything else. But now this is gonna kickstart watching all of them. So like that's what's gonna I know Griff's happy about that. So.
I'm very happy. This is awesome. I love it.
I have only seen the Brosnan and Craig ones. And I was never very interested in them because I always felt like James Bond was a pig. And why would I want to watch this movie about this womanizer, and that's what appealed to me about the Daniel Craig ones, is that he felt like a real person to me, who had like relationships and actually like cared about people.
Yeah.
And so and I know some people didn't like that aspect of it, but that was appealing to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think he's a far more complex character than people sometimes would think or like really care to admit. Like I know there are things that people like about the character, like the aesthetic is obviously a big thing, the lifestyle, the travel log, but ultimately I think he's a very internal character, and he's if you look at him as like an employee for this company, he is someone who has a very complicated to negative relationship with his work, and like he's good at his work but he really hates it. And so I think that right there is immediately something that gives him a bit more texture than just like, oh, he's this womanizer who goes off. It's like yes, he's a very sexual person, and I think during the time when the books were written and when the films were coming out, sex was like pretty taboo. So like to have protagonists like this that were very like, unabashed and kind of willing to I don't know, I guess talk about sex or engage in sex in these interesting ways, I think was liberating for a lot of people. And so Bond's interesting because he is this liberation figure from like the time in which he was created, but I think as the obviously as time has gone on, he's kind of taken on the figure of just like he's a government agent who has to learn to have autonomy and question the nature of his government and the missions that he goes on, and which is very in line with I think how Fleming wrote him, which is why the Daniel Craig films, the Timothy Dalton films, those two eras specifically, I think are very close to the literary Bond, which is interesting. And then you obviously have to take into consideration what the cinematic Bond has become with Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and so there's different elements of the character that I think each tenure chose to focus on, but I've always just gravitated to him because he's an interesting character, and like I love spy movies too, but I think there's just kind of a lot to sort of unpack with a guy that's like really internal and kind of has to learn to be a bit less so, I guess, across his
do you
life.
have a favorite era?
Yeah, the Craig films are definitely my favorite, not just because I grew up with them, but I think they're just
that's
the
fair.
most interesting from a character standpoint. But I
love
feel
like
all
that's
eras.
unusual for big Bond fans, though. Do you think that's unusual?
I mean, it kind of depends on like when you grew up with the films, what elements that you really latch onto. Like people, like I know a lot of like Gen Xers really like the Roger Moore films because they were these explosive, fantastical spy adventures, and they were a little silly, and they were I mean, it's not that they weren't rooted in like hard ground espionage or stuff like that. There were elements of that in there, but they were a bit more fantastical. So there was that escapism. It really leaned into like the tropes of I guess a Bond film, and I don't know, people like that. They like the lightheartedness and the campiness. I mean, for me, it's not that I dislike that, but I just prefer the more character-centric stuff that's grounded in real espionage, personally.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Are you a fan of Rachel's reviews? Do you look forward to Family Movie Night, Female Film Critics panels, or the Talking Disney podcast? If so, please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a Patreon. As a patron, you get to access monthly events such as the watch-alongs and Q&As, where you get to talk to stars and find out the behind the scenes of the movie making industry. And you can pick what I review for Family Movie Night, or even become a guest on the podcast. Podcasts and YouTube channels are expensive, and I really, really could use your help. I would so appreciate it. You also get to be a member of the Facebook group where we talk about all the films that we're seeing, and we have so much fun. Go to patreon.com/Hallmarkies and select one of the Rachel's fan tiers. That's patreon.com/Hallmarkies.
You, Mondo, was there something that kept you from embracing the series and watching more of them, or it's just one of those things?
I now you've like led me to actually say this. I grew up with Mission Impossible, so that's the thing where like I'm sorry, I didn't want to say it, but
That's
like
fine,
this is the
that's
question
fine.
that would make me answer it. Yeah, I grew up with Ethan Hunt versus James Bond, and I guess Pierce Brosnan would have been the Bond at the time that I would have come up with, and that wasn't just. I guess I didn't watch it in my household, but it was mainly like Mission Impossible. But then when Casino Royale came out, I was like, whoa, like this is a Bond movie. Like I was so impressed by it. It's still like my all-time favorite is Casino Royale, because like I love poker, and just watching all of that unfold in the way it was done, like Casino Royale is my favorite. But yeah, it was really weird to kind of transition to Bond and get a feel of that character versus like Ethan Hunt and what I've grown with. So it's just interesting to, like, everyone starts at a different time, like, like Griffin said. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about Mission Impossible for me, and we won't dive into this too much, but I feel like Mission Impossible is more about the stunts and the action than it is about Ethan Hunt. Like, I don't feel like I've barely gotten to know him as a human being. And there's been like, what, 7 movies? I don't know, a lot. And, And I've always felt like it was a bit of a shame because the original show was all about the team.
Yeah.
The Mission Impossible team. And they really, because Tom Cruise is such a star, they haven't ever really like monopolized on that, I think, the way they could. But they're fun movies I enjoy. But yeah, I think that's the difference. Like, I wouldn't even necessarily at first think to compare the two franchises. Like, they feel really different to me.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think, it's not that I think Mission Impossible kind of fills the void of like the escapist spy action fantasy that people kind of liked from like the Roger Moore era of Bond and stuff like that. But I do agree. I think that it's mostly a Tom Cruise vehicle. Not to say that Ethan Hunt doesn't really have like a characterization. I just don't really like, I just don't think they've really gone in depth into like who he is as a person outside of like, the few glimpses that we get. And to me, like you said, Rachel, that's what makes those films work, is like the stunts, the action, the all this stuff. It's just kind of like a well-oiled machine, or like a Rube Goldberg machine, really, that we get excitement out of watching. And that's fine, but some of my favorite Mission Impossible entries are the ones that actually feel like spy movies, like I think Ghost Protocol is a perfect.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
Yeah,
very good.
It's such a blast. It's a great spy flick that also has really impressive stunts, which I think is something that Bond pioneered, and Mission has kind of started to go in that way, but I don't know. To me, they've just kind of left the character stuff out of it, which is a bit disappointing. But I get the appeal for those films for sure.
Well, and Bond has such a swagger, he does. There's such an appeal to him just as a character. I mean, do you think that that's what makes him so timeless, like for different eras?
Yeah, because I think there is the timelessness of the character kind of comes down to how Eon and the Broccolis, I think, have approached these films, which is that they're not like this could, like, if you look at a lot of like Bond contemporaries, like Philip Marlowe or oh god, why am I blanking on the other one, like Sherlock Holmes and stuff like that, which kind of feel like they can't move out of the era that they were originated in. Bond was able to do that because the films were willing to evolve with the time period. A guy who like James Bond, who has this complicated relationship with his work and just happens to work for the government, I mean, that's never really going to go out of style per se. And I think as the world has evolved, there are more and more things that you can do with a character like that. There are more, geopolitical ideas that you can address. I mean, you have a film like Tomorrow Never Dies, which I don't know if either of you have seen, but it's a film where that feels like it was made ahead of its time because of its commentary on like media manipulation and these independent private moguls and how they can manipulate facts and stuff like that. Anyways, it's a film that like you watch today and you're like, wow, this was written in the 90s, like geez. So it's like the films have this, the way they tap into current events, they do so very smartly where it never feels dated, but it's also able to feel like a time capsule of that period of time, but it also is able to kind of speak to stuff that we're still dealing with. And so I think just that idea of looking maybe 5 minutes into the future or something like that has always kind of guided these films is part of why they've managed to stay timeless. So there is the aesthetics, the swagger, the travelogue, the stuff that everyone kind of enjoys as an escapism. But to me, that timelessness is really rooted in the way that the films have evolved in how they engage with the world around the character.
Before we dive into Dr. No, I just have to ask, do you have a favorite and least favorite Bond movie?
Favorite is Casino Royale for sure. And then least favorite is probably The Man with the Golden Gun. The movie is just really off-putting for so many reasons. It's like one of the very few films in the canon of Bond that I would say is like bad. Even though we get Christopher Lee as the Bond villain, but it's just,
oh man.
I know.
Wow.
Yeah, it's great. Like he as a character is fantastic and it's the only good part of that film, but like the rest of the film is just like, oof. Like what are we doing here? So
I think the worst of the few that I've seen is probably The World Is Not Enough, I think.
Oh, that's fair. Right? That's interesting. Yeah.
With Christmas.
Yeah, Christmas Jones. That film is really interesting. There's a lot that works for it, but then they don't fully commit to some ideas that I think holds it back. And yeah, Christmas Jones is just kind of a silly character.
Very silly.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive in to Dr. No. And so this movie came out in 1962 and directed by Terrence Young, and of course stars Sean Connery. And it starts out, it's set in Jamaica, and we have our James Bond gets involved in a case involving this mysterious man named Dr. No, and this whole underground society that of Spectre. And so overall, what do you think about this first entry? How do you feel about it, Griffin?
I'm kind of weird where it's like I really really love this film. A lot of Bond fans like this film, and I think they respect this film for what it did to establish the franchise. I've always loved this film because it reminds me of just like a classic Hitchcock thriller, and I mean it's pretty clear that like Terrence Young took a lot of pages out of Hitchcock's book in terms of like the sets, in terms of the pacing, the aesthetic, and then also the way he reveals information feels very Hitchcockian. I mean, nowhere near as good as Hitchcock, because he's kind of a master, but there is that kind of feel to it where you can see that the work of Hitchcock sort of inspired Young's approach to these films. And so being a big Hitchcock fan myself, that's kind of what I latched onto in the early Connery films, but specifically with Dr. No. I think it's just a great jumping off point for the character. We get Bond on a mission that feels like it's happening in his early career. We see a guy who's like really good at his job and is able to go through the motions, and it looks really effortless. And then when we get to the end, he's kind of put in a scenario where he realizes the world isn't necessarily as black and white as perhaps he assumed it was. And so that's kind of a cool thing to see in the film. But for me, the big takeaway and what I really love about this film is how detailed it is when it comes to the actual spy craft. You see him setting up his room, like putting the hair over the closet door, you know, going through all these motions and really getting an understanding of his job and why he's good at it. That feels like stuff that you would have read in one of the Fleming books, because Fleming was really detailed about the proceedings and the environments. And I think this film does an excellent job of really capturing Fleming's voice in that regard. So, and then on top of that, it's just kind of cool to see a film that is like this Cold War spy thriller, and it starts in a very like, you know, grounded, I guess, POV, but then it just kind of escalates into this Doc Savage, like pulpy action film when you get to the end. And that escalation I find to be pretty fun.
What do you think, Manda, of it?
I really enjoyed it. I was engaged. It was great for an introduction to the character. I think we were just like thrown into the familiarity of who like James Bond was without there being like so much exposition, and like just so much like, I guess, backstory for him. It was like, this is 007. We're going to go on this journey with him. But even like the small moments with Moneypenny, I thought was really nice, because you get, again, it's just such a simple way to show many sides of him, which I loved. And I love that interaction. I think like the first like wide, like going behind him at the card table, and then he picks up the cigarette, and like that's the introduction. I was like, oh my God. Like I was like, what do you mean that's how we introduce James Bond? Like that was just so effective. It was fantastic. So cool. It was so sick, so well done. But even like the theme song coming in and just being so iconic, and just like fusing like with every scene, like it was just so good. And the opening title, like it's just such a perfect standalone as well, which is important. Mm-hmm. But then to build an entire franchise out of it with like what goes into making a Bond film, like it's just a perfect introduction to a franchise. Is so good to the character.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think it had a really good villain. It was very entertaining, over the top. If people know, listen to my Disney content, I'm so tired of always having to have these multifaceted villains. Like, we can't just have anybody be like a bad guy anymore. Like, this was fun and over the top. I was surprised that they were so fast and loose with like radiation and nuclear power, and like,
I know
this could be bad. Like there's a lot of spaces where there could be explosions and people would, like, what?
yeah.
I mean, you think that would have been pretty tense in 1962. So that was kind of funny. But yeah, I mean, it was an entertaining film. I enjoyed it, and I thought it was an interesting way to sort of start it up with, because they had him, I think, be pretty valuable for your James Bond. Like he gets knocked out, he gets beaten up, he gets given the sleeping Once at a certain point, he's has to go through all these decontamination things. I'm like, they're going to a lot of effort to make him, they could just shoot him, but they're going to a lot of effort.
But I think that's what's so. Yeah, well, I was going to say I think that's what's really interesting is the fascination that Dr. No has with Bond in this, where it's like he kind of. I think it's really telling when you get into Dr. No's lair and you see all this art from like, the East or the West. It doesn't really matter. And he's just kind of a collector of fine things and someone who's kind of sick of playing like geopolitics on both sides or the West is the good guys and the East are the bad guys and stuff like that. He's been rejected by both. And so he's operating in this middle space for himself. And in Bond, I think he's really fascinated because he sees someone who does appreciate fine things and could potentially, I guess join him or appreciate what it is that he's doing. And when he finds out that Bond doesn't really get what he's doing and he just calls him a stupid policeman, I think that's really, I don't know, it's really interesting because I think while Bond doesn't necessarily recognize that he's operating in a very nations-based binary right there. When you watch From Russia with Love and then Goldfinger, you kind of see how the character evolves in Connery's early tenure. You see how he does become he becomes a bit less slavish to the government that he's working for, and then he kind of starts relying on his own instincts as an agent and his own autonomy. And this is that first step to getting that. So I think that whole dynamic between the two of them and Dr. No, kind of being just so fascinated by Bond as this figure is part of what makes, for a character who doesn't have a lot of screen time, that the scenes we do get with him are monumental, and I think Joseph Wiseman really plays into that beautifully, and you get an interesting dynamic where it's like, even though Dr. No is only on screen for, I don't know, however many minutes he's on screen, his presence is really felt throughout the whole film.
Yeah. Well, and I think the fact that it is dealing with something like nuclear weapons like that.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have to necessarily be on screen to be like, oh, this is big.
Right. Well, yeah, it kind of captures that Cuban Missile Crisis, paranoia, I guess, of the time pretty well.
Mm-hmm. We'd like to take a second to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's the new book, Zoe Brennan, First Crush by Laura Piper Lee. In Zoe Brennan, First Crush, a struggling vineyard owner, Zoe Brennan, gets a second taste of first love in a sapphic romantic comedy that sparkles with humor and heat. From Laura Piper Lee, author of the witty Hannah Tate Beyond Repair, Zoe's story is both a spin-off and a standalone novel with plenty of spice. You'll have a great time reading it. You can get it wherever you purchase your books or use the affiliate link below. That's Zoe Brennan, First Crush. Manda, what did you think of Sean Connery? You've seen Daniel Craig. What did you think of Sean Connery?
I was dead. Like I was like, what? No, because I watched him. My only other like Sean Connery film technically was The Untouchables, because I still haven't watched The Last Crusade.
Holy cow!
Terrible blind spot. I know it's terrible,
wow.
But I've only watched The Untouchables. So this is like really an introduction to a very young Sean Connery. And the second he was on screen, I'm like, I get it. I'm like, I understand. But I think for me, because there's like, it's a dry humor, his delivery. And I tweeted this out. That's like literally where I kind of felt even more in love with him as the character, because it's just so dry. And I was just like, oh my God, he's funny. Like it's actually like a funny Bond at the same time. And it comes down to the way he delivers it, the way he's portraying this character. But he is like, I said this too in a tweet. I replied to someone and I said, he's like Paul Newman level, like cool on screen. Like, it's just that presence of like, this is the coolest guy, the most effortless performance for this character. And I loved him. I thought, like, I don't even know if I can even sit through Timothy Dalton or Roger Moore or Pierce Brosnan after this, because I was just like, whoa, I get it. Like, Daniel Craig is great. He was technically my introduction. I thought he was great. But there was just something about Connery. He has like this charisma. It's just fantastic to watch him in this role. I was completely taken by him. It was great. Yeah.
I think some of these opening scenes are very effective with that. Like, I really liked when he's sitting in the office with whoever that secretary is, and he's just like flirting back and forth with, it's not even like a love interest. It's just another woman, but he was so
So charming. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. I always love the Moneypenny and Bond interactions, specifically in the Connery films, because I just think Lois Maxwell and Sean Connery have really, really great chemistry.
Yeah,
and it's such a hard relationship to nail because it could easily kind of fall into being this uncomfortable like sexual harassment. But I think what works about it is that she's fucking with him as much as he's kind of like messing with her. Like it's very even-handed, it's evenly flirtatious. And then as you get into some of the later films, you really see how she puts him in his place a couple of times, and that's a really fun thing to get. And so I love Moneypenny so much, and those two together, that this version of those two characters is probably one of my favorite dynamics outside of maybe Pierce Brosnan and Samantha Bond in those films. But
I didn't realize that was her name, but yeah.
Oh
that was fun.
Yeah,
it was fun.
It's great.
And then there's this Sylvia Trench. She's the first of the women.
Mm-hmm.
And are all of these early Bond movies, do they have multiple women? Or is there just one Bond woman?
It depends. So like the first, Sylvia Trench is a recurring character in the first two films, but she's just kind of like the fling that he has at the beginning before he kind of goes off onto the mission. And then there's like the proper Bond woman. So like in From Russia with Love, it's why am I fucking blanking? Or well, I think it's like Tanya or something like that. She's a Russian agent, and so there's that whole thing. But then in this one, the main one is Ursula Andress as Honey Rider. So there's like your big one, and then some films have like a femme fatale. Some films don't have any other supporting female characters like that are Bond women. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, because this one it has her, Sylvia Trench, and then it has Miss Taro.
Right.
And then it has Honey Rider.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of interesting.
Three.
Yeah, I guess they kind of do have the femme fatale in here. I mean, I wouldn't call Miss Taro like a femme fatale necessarily, but she is obviously kind of playing Bond as much as he is playing her. So I guess you have like the pieces in there for what would evolve as the film kind of goes on. But yeah, it is interesting. There's a lot of you get to a certain point in the film and you're like, oh, this is going to be like the main Bond woman, and then you're like, oh wait, no, it's not. And then you get to Honey Rider and like the third act of the film, and you're like, oh, this is the proper one. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite of the Bond women?
Yeah, Vesper, Eva Green's Vesper Lind. I think she's
yes.
Yeah, she's the best.
I was
she's
obsessed with her. Yes,
I love her. Yeah.
Oh my God, yes.
She's Mona, what do you think of the women in this one?
I like the way it kind of played out. Like you have the first, and then the second was when I swear I was dying of laughter when like they did the deed, and then he just like shoves her into the police car right after. I was like, I'm like, what? I literally wrote in my notes, I'm like, what a savage. I was like, I liked even more after that. I was like, what? But Ursula Andress, I was like, whoa. She coming out of that water, I'm like, I get it. Like that's OG Bond girl. Like, I totally get that. She was fantastic, and their chemistry was really good.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
it was really nice. It was just even just them having conversations, and just the way that he looked at her and the way that she looked at him. Like those small moments, it was really effective, and you believed, their relationship and how it was like blossoming at the end. I really liked her.
Yeah. Well, it was especially fun when he comes back for her. And it's kind of like, you all didn't think I'd leave her behind, right?
Yeah.
That was good. And I was impressed because I was kind of watching it. Not that I'm like a super woke viewer of things, but it was just like what had turned me off as a teenager from the series.
Sure.
And so I was kind of looking for that. And I did feel like it was all pretty consensual.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like if anything in Spectre with Monica Bellucci, like that one's way more shady. That relationship. And so there's some modern ones that give me more question than any of the three that were in this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of the older films do have this reputation of Bond kind of like forcing himself on to some of the Bond women and stuff. And like, I'm not gonna sit here and say that there aren't films where that is where there are films where that definitely is the case, but I think by and large there is a lot of like the relationships are a bit more complex. And then also when you're dealing in spycraft, sometimes you have female characters weaponizing their sexuality against him, and then him doing the same, so you get a more complex thing going on there. But I mean, Honey Rider, while like not the most profound or deep character, I think is a very strong presence in the film. I mean, she's someone who has clearly gone through a lot, given her upbringing, kind of like moving around and then losing her dad, and then I'm pretty sure they kind of allude to the rape scene that happens, or not. It's not a scene, but she was like sexually assaulted as a young girl, and then gets her, revenge on that guy. And so like she's clearly someone who has been through a lot, specifically that at the whims of men, and has kind of carved out this little space for herself. And I think Bond is really receptive to that. I think he respects that. And after she kind of like says everything that she says about her upbringing, and specifically like her life and whatnot, you see him start to look at her a bit differently. Like, oh, this isn't just some bimbo on a beach looking for shells. Like, this is someone who is like pretty savvy and street smart, and perhaps a bit more intelligent than he would have given her credit for. And so again, I think it's Bond having to learn to look past his very black and white view of things and understand that the world is a bit more complex, and you get that through a character like Honey Rider for sure.
So in future movies, do you see more of M? Because he really wasn't in this very much.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. Every Bond film, there's a briefing scene with M. Sometimes M plays a bit more of a supporting role in the film, depending. Like some of the Craig films, especially, you really get M as a supporting character. Whether it's Judi Dench, who literally is like the Bond girl in Skyfall, if you ask me. And then with Ray Fiennes in No Time to Die, I mean, he's a pretty big supporting character. So it depends on the mission, but with each of these films, M is usually there for the briefing, and then sometimes there's a bit of a butting heads between Bond and him. But he's not always, I guess the character is never really like in it like a super big amount through most of the films.
Things.
Yeah, but they're he's the exposition mouthpiece.
Well, in this one, we meet Felix Leiter, CIA agent, American.
Yes.
So I think he's immediately a suspect. As American.
Yeah. Felix is great. I love, this is probably, like, outside of Jeffrey Wright, this is my favorite version of Felix, because it's played by Jack Lord, and like Jack Lord is like one of the coolest guys.
Okay,
ever.
So he's in multiple.
No, well, not
Felix.
this. Felix is in multiple films. Yes.
Okay.
This specific portrayal by Jack Lord, he is only in Dr. No, which is a shame, because I think he embodies that character so effortlessly, and I think him and Connery have incredible chemistry. I mean, you talk about Connery being this embodiment of cool. I think Jack Lord is quite literally the only other person that could match that level of coolness. And you definitely get that in the scenes with him. I mean, he's not like a super complex character in this film. In later films, he gets way more developed. I mean, in License to Kill, he is kind of the impetus for everything that happens, in Bond's relationship with him is what kind of kickstarts that film into motion. But I love him. I love how they're so dubious of each other at first, and then they kind of realize they're on the same side, and I don't know, there is this like camaraderie and respect between the two of them. And I don't know, Jack Lord is just like so much fun to watch. I love him.
There's also Quarrel. He has a fight with him at the beginning, and then they end up working together. And he's kind of his ambassador there on the island. Kind of gets him into things, and I was sad that
Me too.
Yeah, it's brutal. Yeah, he gets torched. It's pretty brutal for a film like that.
It really was.
I was watching it, I'm like, but the MPA rating back then, I was so skeptical of what they allowed and what like they didn't want to show. I'm like, what'd you guys do here? But
yeah.
We'd like to take a second and thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's the Hallmarkies merch store.
Are you looking for that perfect gift for the postable, Hardy, or Hallmarky in your life?
What about getting that t-shirt or hoodie that will help you stand out at your next holiday party?
Now is the time to check out the Hallmarkies merch store.
Full of festive designs by artists like Jessica Miller, Carrie from Hallmark Comics, and more.
You can even have more than just shirts, but totes, cell phone cases, notebooks, mugs, and more.
And it isn't just Hallmark. We have designs for Anna Green Gables, Man from Snowy River, The Nanny, and more.
Every purchase at the merch store goes to help support the podcast and allows us to make the great content you know and love.
There are frequent sales, so go to tpublic.com/stores/Hallmarkies or see the link in the description.
That's tpublic.com/stores/Hallmarkies.
So they're trying to figure out what happened with these people strange ways who were murdered at the beginning.
Yeah.
And he has this guy Dent gave them gave them samples.
Mm-hmm.
And the sample's radioactive. So that's where it starts to go, and it all leads to this Dr. No situation. And and then he meets Honey Rider. And I just thought I did think it was really funny when they go to all of this effort to decontaminate them.
Yeah, it's so insane. Yeah,
that was such a good scene.
I think Braun makes a comment about that in that dinner scene where he's talking about he's like, I really hope that the efforts you went for the Jesus, I can't say it, decontamination was worth it or whatever. He's like kind of jesting at his intelligence. That was a fun little bit.
What did you think, Wanda, of the tarantula scene?
Listen, I'm an arachnophobe. I was like this. I'm like, why aren't you moving? I'm like, he's way smarter in this moment. But like, why aren't you moving? I was dying. I swear to you. But even just the sweat on his face, just the way that was directed, I was like, I feel it too, man. I feel it. But when everything, it crawled, even the score as well in that moment. Because then when he actually beats the spider, the score goes with the beating of the spider too. So I'm like, oh my God, I was really feeling it. But that whole spider scene, I just could not do it. I knew you were going to bring it up too. But that was a massive tarantula. I didn't know those existed. They're massive, but kudos to him.
Yeah, it doesn't make you want to go to Jamaica, does it?
No, I'm okay. There or Australia, I'm good.
Yeah,
not doing it.
That's such a fun scene. That's one of my favorite scenes of the film too. Just the tension's great. His the sweat on his face is insane, and then the beating with the shoe and the timed with the music. I mean, I have a friend who's it's very Looney Tunes-esque, but I kind of get into it. It's funny.
I liked the way it was filmed, and you could it's really on his shoulder, and he's just
I don't know how he did it.
It was good.
Yeah. What a trooper.
Yeah, what a trooper.
So then, like she said, after they are decontaminated, then he gets drugged, and then they end up at dinner, and that's when they send Honey away.
Mm-hmm.
And then we find out that Dr. No is a member of Spectre.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how has Spectre evolved over the years in the movies to you?
Well, I think Spectre is really interesting because it's this private entity that operates outside of the government, and yet is very it kind of liaises with the various governments of the world in order to get profit or whatever. They're less an organization based around world domination, and more so just about trying to play the governments of the world in order to get money.
It's like a mafia, but for the world.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. So there's some, I guess, more controlling world domination plans that happen a bit down the road in some of the films, but they're always kind of rooted in just a general, a corporate business model, which I think makes them a really interesting adversary for Bond. But yeah, Spectre is just this shadow organization that Bond has to confront across his journeys, and specifically with their leader Blofeld. He's like the main arch nemesis for Bond, and you find more out about him in future films. So I don't want to like say too much, but it's yeah, I don't know. It's just like it's the Hydra, or the whatever. What am I trying to think? Like, just it's the shadow organization for our protagonist.
Yeah. So he's thinking, Dr. No thinks that he can convince Bond to go to his side like he could with Dent.
Yeah.
And so that's why he's like trying to kind of wine and dine him at first.
Yeah.
And then he realizes that he can't, then he won't. And so then he ends up in jail. And I did think it was really funny that this air vent that he escapes in is like the biggest air vent ever.
It's insane. Yeah. The design, I mean, the production design in general for this film is really striking, specifically like Dr. No's lair. Like there's just there's so many cool shots. There's so many like just interesting, I don't know, set pieces, and the lighting is great. And I mean, it's all thanks to Ken Adam, who is the production designer on a lot of those early Bond films. And he's part of what makes the aesthetic of those films really pop. It just, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And so then he ends up in the main center where there's all kinds of bubbling liquids, and things seem very shady. I mean, I would be very nervous if I was there. And it was a pretty satisfying end for Dr. No.
Mm-hmm.
They're fighting, and he ends up like boiling him basically.
Yeah.
That was pretty wild.
It was funny seeing his glove just trying to like latch on, and he couldn't. Like at that point, I was like, "Sorry, buddy." Like, you're drowning.
Like, is he gonna turn into the Joker in a few minutes?
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I read I'm pretty risky to set off a nuclear reaction.
Yeah.
It's true.
But it was entertaining, and then he goes back and he saves Honey. And so that was good.
Yeah, that's great. Great.
So yeah, I enjoyed it. I had a good time with it, and I asked on Twitter what people thought, and Christian Pastrop says kind of find it dull. Signed a Bond fan. That's what he says. Depp says, what happened? I think they were going to a funeral. This movie is great.
That's great. Yeah,
perfect.
that was a good like little one liner in there. Yeah, I going back to the dull thing. That's a opinion shared by I think a lot of like hardcore Bond fans. Is sort of what I was saying earlier. Like it's a film that a lot of them respect, but it's not one that a lot care to revisit, or a lot of people feel like it's still kind of figuring out what it is at this point, and then we don't really figure out what the films are, or we don't really figure out what the formula is until we get to Goldfinger. And while I mean I think that's kind of true to an extent in my opinion, and I mean I guess you guys can kind of let me know what you think, but like I think that the building blocks are all there really for what this franchise becomes. I mean, it might not be as like hyper stylized as what it is in Goldfinger, but I think Dr. No really right out the gate firmly establishes the template for these movies.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Like the foundation is definitely there.
Yeah,
they can still play around with it because it's like it's early in the franchise, which is great, but like the structure's there for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Darren from Nostalgic Hess, he says top 6 Bond, back when they were still spoofs but treated the material like serious spycraft. Seaside Movies, he says, I really enjoy this first Bond, and I am in the minority which likes it better than From Russia with Love.
Wow.
The scene of Bond behind the door is iconic.
Yeah, I loved that. Yeah, I love that. That was good too.
Lisley SNL says, watched it today at the start of my marathon. Good movie, a good start to the franchise, but a bit dated and very vanilla. There'll be better Bond films ahead, in my opinion. And then Luke Irwin says, rewatched this one not too long ago, so he enjoyed it.
Nice.
Yeah, so a bunch of different opinions, always fun.
Yeah, for sure.
To hear what people think.
Yeah,
So,
I'll be curious what you guys think as you kind of go through these films, specifically with From Russia with Love, which I think is probably that's like a top 5 Bond film to me. So like you're already starting off on a pretty like high note, and then it just like boom, it gets to like one of the best in the entire series in the next outing. So it's great.
cool.
I have to give it more than a 5 out of 5. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. I know. When I saw that you gave it a 5, I was like, yes, let's go.
I was waiting. Excited. I'm like, I know he's gonna be so happy.
Yeah.
Gonna change the series to the Blind Spot Bond series.
Yeah, for real. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Awesome. Yeah, it was fun.
Well, thank you so much, Griffin, for doing this. This was so fun.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it. And let us know if you're listening, what you think of this movie and of Bond in general and all the things we talked about. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. And thanks so much, Monda. And where can people find you?
Me, yes. You guys can always follow me over at AMX NDA Reviews on Twitter and Blue Sky and Threads. I'm all there. And you can check out my website, candidxcinema.com.
Great. And Griffin, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, all that stuff like that at Griff Schiller. And then you can also head on over to the Film Speak YouTube channel where I do deep dives into new releases, legacy films, video essays, all kinds of stuff like that. So if you're into that, check it out.
Yes. So our February blind spot is going to be Punch Drunk Love by director Paul Thomas Anderson. So that's going to be super fun. We always try to pick a romance, in February. So that'll be good. So definitely make sure you're checking that. And you can find me at Rachel's Reviews all over the place. And if you are listening on iTunes, please leave your ratings and reviews. Make sure you check out the written review that I'll do on my site, and then also our playlist with all the other movies that we've done. Now we're over a year, so it's very fun that we've been doing this. And then if you are watching on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. We appreciate that so much. We also have our Patreon group and merch store. Check that out. And thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk to you later. Bye.